Millionaire took his spoiled son to live in the countryside. When he visited him, he nearly fainted from shock. Ricardo Salazar was a man whose name inspired respect and admiration in business circles. Owner of an incalculable fortune, built with shrewdness and relentless work, he epitomized the dream of many, an empire raised from nothing, sustained by the vision and determination of a man who knew what he wanted from life. With properties around the world, companies operating in various sectors, and an endless list of powerful contacts, Ricardo seemed to have everything under control. However, there was one part of his life that he couldn't master, no matter how hard he tried. His only son, Arthur, only 16 years old, was becoming a constant source of worry and frustration. Arthur was everything Ricardo hadn't been in his youth: spoiled, arrogant, and unable to understand the value of effort and discipline. While Ricardo had fought for every penny he earned, Arthur had grown up surrounded by luxury, with everything money could buy. In recent years, the situation had worsened. Arthur's behavior had gone from merely reckless to outright destructive. Endless parties in rented mansions, luxury cars bought with his father's credit card, and a series of problems at school, from low grades to fights with other students, had become routine. Ricardo, always busy, tried to manage the situation from a distance, hiring tutors, psychologists, and even bodyguards to keep his son in line, but nothing seemed to work. The breaking point came on a Friday night when Ricardo received an unexpected call. It was Arthur's school principal, a usually calm man whose voice now trembled with anger. "Mr. Salazar, I need you to come here immediately. Your son, Arthur, has caused a serious problem this time." Ricardo didn't need more details. He knew it was serious. He drove to the school, his face a mask of frustration and exhaustion, dark thoughts racing through his mind. Upon arrival, he found Arthur sitting in an isolated room, arms crossed, with a defiant look on his face. The principal explained that Arthur had gotten into a fight with another student and that this time, the consequences could be legal. The other boy's father was considering taking the matter to court. This was the last straw. Ricardo, who had always tried to shield his son from the harsh realities of life, now saw clearly that his approach had failed. It was time for a drastic change, one that went beyond any measure he had taken before. Back at the mansion, Ricardo locked himself in his office, the weight of the imminent decision heavy on his shoulders. The room, filled with books, documents, and artifacts that told the story of his achievements, suddenly seemed small and oppressive. He spent hours in silence, contemplating his options. He knew he needed to do something radical, something that would shock Arthur and force him off his self-destructive path. Then he remembered his great-uncle Joaquim. A simple man of few possessions but with wisdom that Ricardo had always admired. Joaquim lived on a modest farm in the countryside, far from the hustle and excesses of the big city. Ricardo had always known that Joaquim represented the opposite of his urban life, the countryside, the land, simplicity. Perhaps this was exactly what Arthur needed. The idea took shape in his mind: send Arthur to live with Joaquim, to learn about life in the hardest and most authentic way possible. Far from the parties, the shallow friends, and everything money could buy. Ricardo knew it would be tough, both for him and his son, but it was a decision he was willing to make. His love for Arthur was deep, and he knew that to save his son from himself, he needed to do something extreme. The next day, Ricardo called Arthur to his office. The young man entered with the expression of someone about to hear yet another lecture. But this time, Ricardo was direct. "Arthur, I've tried everything to help you find the right path, but nothing has worked. So, I've decided that you're going to spend some time with your great-uncle Joaquim, on his farm." Arthur laughed, incredulous. "You must be joking, Dad. Me? On a farm? I'm not going anywhere." Ricardo remained calm, though his heart was heavy. "This isn't a choice, Arthur. You're going. And you'll stay there as long as it takes." What followed was a heated argument, where Arthur tried every way to convince his father to abandon the idea. But Ricardo was resolute. He knew this was the only way to save his son from a bleak future. And even though it broke his heart, he couldn't back down. 2 days later, Arthur was sent to Joachim's farm. The journey was long and silent. Arthur didn't say a word during the trip, only looking out the window with anger and disgust. When they finally arrived, the contrast between the life he knew and the new reality awaiting him was shocking. The farm was simple, without any luxuries, and great-uncle Joachim, a man of few words, greeted him with a nod and a brief welcome. Ricardo, watching his son being led into the house, felt a mix of pain and hope. He knew that this decision could change everything, for better or worse. But at that moment, all he could do was hope that the simple life of the countryside was what Arthur needed to rediscover his true self. As he drove back to the city, Ricardo couldn't stop thinking about whether he had made the right decision. This was the final test. And only time would tell if Arthur would pass or fail. Arthur woke up to the sound of a rooster crowing, a sound he had never heard so closely before. The first morning on the farm brought with it a harsh reality check. He was lying in a hard bed, in a simple room where the luxury of silk sheets and the softness of expensive pillows were mere distant memories. The lack of comfort was just the first sign that his life had changed drastically. In the first few days, every task was a monumental challenge. Joachim, his great-uncle, seemed to be made of stone. With piercing eyes and an unflinching expression, he offered nothing more than brief instructions. Wake up at 5, fetch the firewood, feed the chickens. Harsh words that echoed in the silence of the farm, making it clear that there was no room for weakness. Arthur, however, was not used to this kind of life. Accustomed to the comfort and conveniences of technology, he grumbled with each task, wishing more than ever that it was a nightmare from which he could wake up. The first day seemed endless. The heat of the sun, the dust kicked up by the breeze, and the strong smell of animals created an almost unbearable environment for the boy. He tried to find a way to escape, as he had done so many times before. But on the farm, there was no internet to distract him, no friends to meet, and no parties to attend. The reality was harsh and unforgiving, and Arthur soon realized that resistance was futile. Each task Joachim gave him seemed heavier than the last. Arthur found himself carrying buckets of water, chopping wood, and dealing with animals he had never seen up close before. His body, accustomed to the sedentary life of the city, protested in pain and exhaustion. He felt his muscles, once weak and underutilized, being forced to work in ways he never imagined. By the end of the first day, Arthur could barely move. His arms and legs ached, and the smell of sweat mixed with dirt clung to his skin. But Joachim showed no signs of compassion. He watched his great-nephew with an almost unsettling calm, as if he knew exactly what was going through the boy's mind. He offered no words of comfort, just a look that seemed to say, "This is just the beginning." In the days that followed, Arthur began to understand that there was no escaping this new way of life. He still felt angry at his father for sending him to that middle of nowhere, but something began to change inside him. Perhaps it was the extreme exhaustion that made him sleep like a rock every night, or perhaps it was the feeling that, despite all the hardship, he was starting to get used to the routine. Waking up before the sun rose, working until his body begged for rest, and then finally sleeping with the knowledge that he had accomplished something. This was life on the farm. Slowly, Arthur's resistance began to fade. He no longer grumbled as much while doing his chores, and his mind, once so focused on the futility of urban life, began to notice the small beauties of the countryside. The sun rose in a spectacle of colors he had never appreciated before, the birds sang melodies that had previously gone unnoticed, and the fresh, pure air filled his lungs in a way that the city's pollution never could. There was a silent peace there, a tranquility that starkly contrasted with the chaos and rush of city life. Arthur began to bond with the locals, something he initially never imagined doing. They were simple people, with lives shaped by hard work and community. At first, Arthur saw them as distant figures, almost caricatures of a world he considered archaic. But over time, this view changed. He began to see the wisdom in the wrinkles of their aged faces, the strength in the calloused hands that greeted him every morning, and the genuineness in the smiles offered to him without expecting anything in return. There was something in these people that Arthur didn't find in the rich, superficial friends he had in the city. Perhaps it was their honesty, or the fact that here, he wasn't seen as the millionaire's son, but simply as Arthur, a boy learning how to truly live. He befriended one of the neighboring farmer's sons, a boy his age named Pedro. Pedro was the opposite of Arthur in almost every way, simple, straightforward, but with a zest for life that contrasted with the cynicism Arthur had cultivated. They spent time together, working side by side, and gradually, Arthur began to understand the value of a friendship built on something real, not on favors or the pursuit of status. With each passing day, Arthur felt a part of himself, which he hadn't even known existed, beginning to awaken. The satisfaction of completing a difficult task, seeing the result of his work in the soil, in caring for the animals, began to take root in his heart. He was still the city boy, but something deeper was growing within him, a connection to the land, to hard work, and to the simplicity he once despised. Arthur's awakening was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but undeniable. He was changing. And although he didn't want to admit it, this change brought with it a sense of purpose that he had never felt before. The countryside, which at first seemed like a prison, was beginning to feel like home. And with it, Arthur was starting to find something that city life had never offered him, inner peace. Months passed slowly for Ricardo Salazar, who, despite his firm decision, began to question whether he had done the right thing by sending Arthur to the farm. With no direct news from his son, anxiety began to eat away at his tranquility. Ricardo was a man used to control, to having every aspect of his life and business in perfect order. However, when it came to Arthur, everything seemed to slip through his fingers. He didn't know if life in the countryside was having a positive effect on the boy or if his son was rebelling even more against him. One random afternoon, after concluding a business meeting that, although profitable, couldn't distract him from thoughts of Arthur, Ricardo decided he needed to see his son with his own eyes. A surprise visit seemed the best solution. He wanted to observe how Arthur was doing without interference, without the pressure of having to impress his father. He wanted to see the truth. Ricardo organized the trip quietly, informing only his secretary that he would be away for a few days. It was a drastic change in his routine, where even the smallest movements were planned in advance. The simple act of taking a trip without the weight of business responsibilities already seemed like a rupture, but for Ricardo, concern for his son justified any change. The road to the farm was long and winding, very different from the wide, well-paved avenues of the big city. As he distanced himself from civilization, Ricardo's thoughts became more introspective. He remembered the last major disagreement with Arthur, which had culminated in the decision to send him to the farm. The harsh words, the rebellion in his son's eyes, and the silence that followed the boy's departure, all of it weighed on his conscience. When he finally spotted the farm on the horizon, a mix of apprehension and curiosity took hold of Ricardo. The place was much simpler than he remembered from the few times he had been there during his youth. Joaquim's house, a man who had always been a distant figure in his life, seemed smaller and more rustic than in his memories. The fresh air and the silence, broken only by the sounds of animals, sharply contrasted with the frenetic pace of urban life. Upon arrival, Ricardo was met with an unexpectedly warm reception. The locals, who rarely saw visitors in those parts, recognized him immediately. "You're Arthur's father, aren't you?" an elderly lady asked, with a sincere smile. Ricardo, who had expected looks of distrust or indifference, was instead surrounded by affectionate comments about his son. "The boy has changed a lot since he arrived here," remarked a man with calloused hands. "At first, it seemed like it wouldn't work out, but he's a good kid, he just needed some guidance." These words began to spark a glimmer of hope in Ricardo's heart. Could it be that sending Arthur to the countryside had indeed been the right decision? He didn't want to raise his expectations, but curiosity and a hint of paternal pride began to emerge. Ricardo continued on his way to the main house, where he spotted Joaquim from a distance, standing next to a fence in need of repair. Beside him was Arthur. But the boy he saw was not the same Arthur he had sent to the farm months ago. The shock was immediate, almost paralyzing. Arthur looked visibly different. The slim and lanky frame from before had gained muscle, his once pale face was now tanned by the sun, and his eyes, previously filled with arrogance and defiance, now shone with a new light, a focus Ricardo had never seen before. Arthur was working on the fence, dirt-streaked, but there was something in the way he moved his hands, in the care with which he adjusted each piece of wood, that conveyed a deep satisfaction. This wasn't the work of a boy forced into a task he despised, it was the work of someone who, in some way, had found meaning in the activity. Ricardo stood there, motionless, observing the scene. He felt the ground vanish beneath his feet, as if everything he knew was being questioned. How was it possible that the boy who couldn't go a day without his phone was now here, in the countryside, doing the kind of work he once considered degrading? He felt a mix of pride and confusion, an urgent need to understand what had happened to his son. Arthur, in turn, finally noticed his father's presence. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. There was hesitation in Arthur's posture, as if he himself didn't know how to react to Ricardo's presence in the environment he now considered his own. But instead of looking away or showing signs of resentment, Arthur greeted him with a shy but genuine smile, one that spoke more than any words could. Ricardo approached slowly, trying to find the right words to express what he was feeling. But seeing his son's transformation, he realized that there might not be enough words to describe the impact of that moment. This was no longer the boy he had sent to the farm. Something profound had changed in Arthur, and Ricardo wasn't sure if he felt pride, relief, or a subtle fear that his son had drifted forever from the world he so cherished. As Joaquim observed the interaction between father and son with a knowing look, Ricardo finally found his voice. "Arthur, you..." He began, but quickly fell silent, still uncertain how to continue. Arthur, however, just smiled again, as if he fully understood what his father was trying to say. The surprise visit had turned into a revelation. Ricardo still had many questions, but one thing was certain: sending Arthur to the farm had been one of the best decisions he had ever made, even if it was hard to admit it to himself. The afternoon when Ricardo and Arthur finally sat down to talk was a turning point in both of their lives. Under the clear, starry sky of the countryside, father and son, who had previously struggled to exchange words without clashing, now found themselves in the midst of a deep and unexpected connection. There was something special about the simplicity of that setting, in the gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the trees, and in the comforting silence that filled the space between them. It was there, by the small campfire that Joaquim had lit to ward off the evening chill, that Arthur's transformation began to fully unfold. Arthur was the first to break the silence. With a voice that carried the seriousness of someone who had matured beyond his years, he began to recount his first days on the farm. "I thought you were punishing me," he confessed, looking into the fire, as if the dancing flames helped organize his thoughts. "The first days were terrible. I felt like I had lost everything, that I was trapped in a place where nothing made sense to me." Ricardo listened in silence, guilt twisting in his chest. He remembered Arthur's look of despair and anger when he sent him to the countryside, and though he believed he was doing what was best for his son, he couldn't deny that part of him feared he had made an irreversible mistake. However, as Arthur continued to speak, that fear was replaced by something unexpected: admiration. But then, things started to change, Arthur continued, now with a sparkle in his eyes that Ricardo had never seen before. "At first, I did everything out of anger, thinking about how great it would be to leave here as soon as possible. But gradually, I started to realize that fighting against it was pointless. The people here, they have something I never had: peace, I guess. They work hard every day, but they're always smiling, always ready to help others. It was the first time I saw someone happy just to be alive." Arthur spoke of the early mornings when he would wake up before sunrise to help Joaquim milk the cows, the afternoons when he would sweat while working in the fields, and the nights when, exhausted, he would sit down at the table for a simple but meaningful meal. He talked about the friendships he made with the locals, humble yet big-hearted people who welcomed him as one of their own. "They taught me to see life differently, Dad. I began to realize that the value of a person isn't in how much they have, but in what they do with what they have." With every word, Ricardo felt a growing pride for his son. Arthur, who once seemed lost in a life of excess, was there, sitting beside him, speaking with a clarity and maturity he had never imagined hearing. The boy who once scorned honest work and simplicity had transformed into a conscious and determined young man. It was hard to believe, but Ricardo knew this was the purest truth. Ricardo looked at Arthur, absorbing every detail of his expression, every nuance of his words. He felt a mix of pride and relief, as if he could finally breathe after months of worry. "I never imagined I'd hear this from you, Arthur," Ricardo said, his voice choked with emotion. "I knew you needed a change, but I confess I was afraid you'd hate me forever for sending you here." Arthur smiled, a genuine smile that Ricardo hadn't seen in a long time. "I thought I hated you at first," he admitted bluntly. "But now, I understand. And I'm grateful. If I'd stayed in the city, surrounded by all that luxury, I would never have realized what really matters. Here, on the farm, I've learned the value of hard work, honesty, and simplicity. And it's changed me." Ricardo fell silent for a moment, Arthur's words echoing in his mind. How was it possible that the son who once seemed completely lost was now there, expressing such a profound understanding of life? He felt there was much more to be said, but Arthur wasn't finished yet. "Dad, I want to go back to the city someday," Arthur said, his voice firm and determined. "But I don't want to return to the old life. I don't want to be just another heir living in the shadow of your success. I want to study, work, and build something for myself using everything I've learned here. I know I can make a difference, but in a meaningful way, something I can be proud of." These words struck deep in Ricardo's heart. He knew he was facing a new Arthur, a young man who, in just a few months, had found a purpose that many spend a lifetime searching for. Ricardo felt a lump in his throat, but this time, it was a lump of happiness. He realized that sending Arthur to the farm had been a risky decision, but at that moment, he understood it had been the best thing he could have done for his son. "Arthur, you have no idea how proud I am of you," Ricardo said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I always wanted you to find your path, and seeing you determined to be a man of value, someone who makes a difference, that's more than I could have ever dreamed." The two sat there, in silence for a while, simply appreciating the moment. Ricardo knew that this conversation marked the beginning of a new phase in Arthur's life and their relationship. It wasn't just a superficial change, it was a profound transformation that would shape their futures in ways Ricardo had never anticipated. As the fire's flames dwindled and the night advanced, Ricardo realized that his son had become not only a man but also an example. And at that moment, he knew Arthur was ready to face any challenge life threw at him, with the same strength and wisdom he had found in the simplicity of rural life. Ricardo decided that the days he would spend on the farm would be dedicated not only to observing but also to actively participating in Arthur's new life. He wanted to intimately understand how that seemingly simple environment had become the catalyst for such a deep transformation in his son. So, he put on the same work clothes Arthur wore daily, and together, they immersed themselves in the farm routine. The first day alongside Arthur was revealing. Ricardo woke up to the sound of the rooster announcing the dawn, a sound that, for his son, had become a natural and pleasant alarm. When he opened the door of the small wooden room where he was staying, Ricardo was greeted by the fresh air and the sight of Arthur already ready, smiling and prepared for the day's work. That scene was the first of many signs that Arthur had found something there that money could never buy. Over the days, Ricardo accompanied his son in all his tasks. Feeding the animals, collecting eggs, preparing the soil for planting. Each activity, which once might have seemed trivial to a man accustomed to city luxuries, now revealed a complexity and importance that Ricardo had never considered. It was as if he was rediscovering, through Arthur's eyes, the value of simplicity, effort, and direct contact with nature. Arthur, for his part, showed himself incredibly comfortable with each of these activities. He not only performed the tasks with skill but did so with a genuine joy that was contagious. The boy who once considered the farm a prison now moved with ease and satisfaction, finding pleasure in daily small victories, like a successful harvest or caring for an injured animal. Ricardo couldn't help but feel a deep admiration for that young man who, just a few months ago, seemed so lost in a life of excesses. One of the most striking experiences for Ricardo was Arthur's interaction with the local residents. As they walked through the small village near the farm, Ricardo was introduced to Arthur's friends, humble people who treated him with genuine affection. It was evident that Arthur had earned the respect and affection of those around him, something Ricardo knew couldn't be bought with money. He heard stories about how Arthur had helped build a community shed or how he volunteered for extra tasks whenever someone needed help. Ricardo's pride in his son grew with every new story, every new gesture of generosity and kindness Arthur demonstrated. During the evenings, father and son sat together under the starry rural sky, talking about the future. Arthur, with his newly discovered maturity, spoke about his plans to return to the city to continue his studies, but made it clear he didn't want to abandon the connection he had formed with the farm. He expressed a desire to find a way to combine his new interests with the family business, perhaps investing in sustainable agriculture or creating initiatives that would benefit both the city and the countryside. Ricardo, moved by this vision, began to realize that Arthur's education could no longer be confined to traditional classrooms. He suggested that, in addition to college, Arthur should continue to spend part of the year on the farm, where he could deepen his practical knowledge and keep alive the passion that had been ignited there. Arthur agreed enthusiastically, and together they began to sketch out plans for the future, discussing how they could use the family resources to promote positive and lasting changes. By the end of Ricardo's stay, the farewell was less a separation and more a new beginning. Father and son had reconnected in a way neither could have predicted. The farm, once a punishment, had become a refuge, a place where Arthur could always return to recharge and remember the fundamental lessons he had learned. Ricardo, for his part, left with the certainty that sending Arthur to the farm had been the hardest, but also the most right decision of his life. Back in the city, Ricardo noticed the immediate changes in Arthur. He enrolled in a university course in environmental engineering, an area that would allow him to apply his new knowledge practically and meaningfully. Arthur threw himself into his studies with the same fervor he had devoted to farm tasks, but now with a clear purpose in mind. He wanted to be an agent of change, someone who could use his education and family resources to make a real impact on the world. In the months that followed, Arthur divided his time between college and the farm. During each vacation period, he returned to the countryside, where he continued to work alongside Joaquim and the friends he had made. These comings and goings became an essential part of his life, a balance between academic knowledge and practical wisdom that he deeply valued. More than ever, Arthur understood that the true value of life lay in the harmony between what one has and what one does with it. Meanwhile, Ricardo, inspired by his son, began to re-evaluate his own business practices. He realized that he could integrate the principles Arthur had learned on the farm into his companies, promoting more sustainable and responsible practices. What had once seemed a simple disciplinary measure had now evolved into a broader movement that would impact the entire family business structure. Ricardo and Arthur began to work together, bringing new ideas and implementing projects that would benefit both the city and the countryside. One of these projects was the creation of a foundation dedicated to sustainable rural development. Arthur led the initiative, using his experiences on the farm as a basis to formulate programs that promoted organic farming, environmental preservation, and support for local communities. The foundation quickly gained recognition, and Arthur became a respected figure both in the city and the countryside, proving that the combination of knowledge and humility can profoundly and enduringly transform the world. Arthur, now a young adult, continued to evolve. The rebellious boy who once despised the countryside had become a principled man, a leader who understood the importance of every gesture, no matter how small. His story was not just about personal transformation but also about the ability to transform the world around him. He had learned, in the hardest way possible, that true wealth is not measured by money but by the actions that define who we are and how we impact others' lives. Alongside his father, Arthur built a legacy that went beyond any material fortune. The farm, once a punishment, had become the foundation of a new vision of life, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Ricardo, in turn, saw his son not just as an heir but as a partner, someone he respected and admired deeply. Together, they proved that true success lies in what we build with our own hands, the positive impact we leave on the world, and, above all, the connections we make along the way. And so, Arthur continued on his path, now with a bright future ahead, guided by the lessons from the farm and the wisdom he had gained. The city and the countryside, once opposing worlds, now coexisted harmoniously in his life, forming the solid foundation upon which he would continue to build his story.